The lives of Japanese on the West Coast were turned upside down on that early Sunday morning in December of '41, and a dark episode began that day for a whole people. On February 19, 1942, President Roosevelt signed into law Executive Order 9066, authorizing our evacuation from the West Coast and internment inland. Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt, in charge of the Western Defense Command, oversaw the removal of all Japanese from what was called the exclusion area, sending everyone initially to temporary assembly centers pending completion of the construction of relocation camps. As a point of information, the area to the right of the guard tower is outside the barbed wire fence, and the area to the left, that inside the barbed wire. One of the rationales given the Japanese community by the military was that this was for our own protection. Notice that the machine gun is pointing toward the inside of the fences, so this rationale was never accepted by the Japanese community. All persons of Japanese ancestry were removed from the exclusion zone for security reasons. Japanese from Hood River in western Oregon were interned at Tule Lake in Northern California, while Japanese from Northern California, northern San Joaquin Valley, and parts of Los Angeles were evacuated to Camp Amache in southeastern Colorado, which was the destination for my family. It's important to note that with the exception of several thousand community leaders, those of Japanese ancestry living in Hawaii were not evacuated or interned. And the reasons being, one, Japanese over the years had become active, contributing members of the local economies and in politics, and had assimilated into island culture. Two, there was a pressing need for help in rebuilding military facilities. Three, the military command in the islands didn't have the same hatred of the Japanese community as did the military command on the West Coast. And four, Japanese made up 40% of the population and half of the skilled labor force of the economic base of the islands. And all of the territory's agriculture would have been lost without Japanese field hands. There are two important facts usually overlooked in our story. J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, reported to President Roosevelt after an extensive investigation that no persons of Japanese heritage in the United States or the territory of Hawaii committed any act of espionage or sabotage, and none was ever charged with a crime. Furthermore, the government's own intelligence reports from the Army's Military Intelligence Division and the Office of Naval Intelligence concluded there was no military necessity to evacuate anyone of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast. However, under intense pressures from some in the War Department, from Western congressmen and farm organizations, Lieutenant General DeWitt, in his final report to the President, declared that there was a military necessity, and he was authorized to proceed with the evacuation and internment. Amache became a full-fledged city essentially overnight, becoming the 10th largest city in Colorado. The barrack structures had been completed, but the interiors were largely unfinished and required installing rolls of black tar paper as a windbreak to make them livable. Water and electricity were not completely functioning yet, nor were toilet and shower facilities, contributing to the already high levels of distress for the internees. Colorado summers are dry, dusty, and often near triple digits, and being in the Dust Bowl area of the state, where there are regular sandstorms that sting the skin with its flying sand. The barracks were built with green wood, so as it dried, it shrank, with the result that the winds brought sand through every crack and crevice, making the sweeping of sand a regular chore. The elevation of Amache is similar to that of Bend or the Sisters, around 3,500 feet, And in winter, the snow was such the men would dig pathways from each apartment to all of the communal facilities. It was so cold, the women crocheted doorknob covers to protect everyone's hands from sticking to the iron doorknobs. Leadership came from among the second-generation Nisei to facilitate governance in camp and to work with camp administration. Business associations were established to coordinate camp businesses. Garden clubs were formed, as were art classes. And this is a carving by my grandfather that my sister owns, and this is one that we have in our home. And of course, there was baseball for recreation. Classrooms, grades 1 through 12, were established with some teaching positions filled by internees, but with most teachers coming from school districts from surrounding communities. The most heart-wrenching part of this evacuation came with the stark uncertainty of everything. People were given just 24 to 48 hours to pack up and be ready to leave, but weren't told their destinations. Allowed to take only what they could carry, everyone was forced to leave all of their possessions behind. Those with businesses or farms had to arrange for them as well as their households. Potential buyers of these belongings offered just pennies on the dollar, and in many cases just waited until evacuees were physically removed, and then they came in and took what they wanted. In our case, friends provided help. The president of the Bank of America, a municipal judge, and the owner of the largest farm in Atwater drew up papers to buy our farm for the sum of $1, held the property, and after the war sold it back to us for the same amount. We were among a few fortunate families that had something to come home to. It's estimated that $400 million worth of businesses and property were left behind and lost by evacuees, equivalent in 2009 to $5.2 billion. Another stressor, particularly for older Japanese, involved food. Initially, there were no Japanese foods served. The diet was essentially European American meat and potatoes. Much of the food was thrown out, being too rich and alien to the tastes, particularly of the elder Japanese. Soon, internees started gardens, and locally grown Japanese foods were then added to the meals. And in-camp production began of tofu, Japanese pickles, and soy sauce. The lack of privacy was especially stressful for most of the internees. Centralized mess halls and shower and bathroom facilities placed added stress on a people for whom modesty is a dominant characteristic. Women would accompany the first-generation Issei women to hold sheets to provide some privacy for showers and bathrooms built without individual stalls. Many women waited all day until after midnight, when bathroom facilities were empty, to use them. The walls between apartments were so thin, families' lives were an unintended open book. Sitting down for meals just as family was virtually impossible. This lack of privacy was particularly difficult for a people who are characteristically shy and who live under a strong cultural ethic of shame. This difficulty was compounded because we were also compelled by cultural mores that called upon us to be friendly and open, in spite of desires sometimes to pull back. One thing that helped was an overriding sense of resignation, a characteristic Japanese trait in the face of overwhelming circumstances. When something goes terribly wrong, it's shikata ga nai, meaning it can't be helped. This is usually said with a shrug of the shoulders. Oftentimes, humor and making light of a situation were used to cover painful emotions and embarrassment. Having said all of this about the forces that were pulling families apart, there was another side to shikata ga nai. In spite of these overwhelming conditions, people tried to make the best of a bad situation. In Japanese, the word gaman means bearing the seemingly unbearable with patience and dignity. Let me repeat that. Bearing the seemingly unbearable with patience and dignity. And it reflects an attitude to pick up and move on, regardless of how bad things are. Many lasting relationships grew out of camp that otherwise would not have occurred but for the internment. In the years following our return home, any mention of camp among Japanese would bring forth an immediate and familiar intimacy, even between strangers. We had been through something profound together. There was one part of the internment, though, that was at once galvanizing to a part of the Japanese community, while splitting it in a wrenching conflict whose painful memories remained for years. In January 1943, the U.S. War Department announced the formation of the segregated 442nd Regimental Combat Team to be made up solely of Nisei draftees from the internment camps. A year after Executive Order 9066 had placed these men behind barbed wire, the wartime draft, which had not been applied to them because they were classified as enemy aliens, was now reversed to include them. The question of volunteering to serve in the U.S. military was a terrible dilemma for the Nisei. Men who volunteered were seen as complicit with those who had violated our constitutional rights. Those who opposed the draft because they, as U.S. citizens, were behind barbed wire stripped of constitutional protections were seen by others as troublemakers. A questionnaire designed to assess loyalty of the internees was administered as part of this process, but it evoked severe reactions because it wasn't applied to other Americans, and its poor wording caused great suspicion over its intended use. The resulting conflict sometimes tore families apart and set friend against friend, and in the end did nothing to identify the disloyal. Resistance and protests by those responding no to questions 27 and 28 resulted in violent reactions that required intervention by the military police and sometimes by the relocation center police, who were often enough relatives or friends. In the end, those men who elected to resist the draft were arrested and jailed, ironically, for draft evasion. Here these men were already behind barbed wire, and for defying the draft, they were arrested and placed in the camp jail. Of the 10,000 resistors from all 10 of the relocation camps, 315 considered serious security risks and suspected of espionage, plus 8,600 no-no boys, were transferred to Tule Lake in Northern California, which served as the repository for these troublemakers. An additional 63 from the Heart Mountain camp in Wyoming, who were tried and convicted of draft evasion, appealed to the Supreme Court, but were denied a hearing and were jailed at Fort Leavenworth Prison in Kansas and McNeil Island Prison in Washington until 1946. To the Issei, the troublemakers, or no-no boys, were viewed as bringing shame not only upon their families, but on the greater Japanese community. In Japanese, the word hagi means shame. Those who did go off to war were admonished by their parents with this message: live if you can, die if you must, but fight always with honor and never ever bring shame on your family or your country. This was a major reason the 442nd fought so valiantly. In Hawaii, Japanese-American soldiers had enlisted in the Territorial National Guard well before Pearl Harbor and were serving in integrated units. Following December 7th, they were summarily discharged as security risks, but later were allowed to volunteer for the newly organized and segregated 100th Infantry Battalion. Military officials in the islands were unprepared to deal with a segregated unit and sent them to the mainland for specialized training. Mixing the Hawaiians with mainland volunteers exposed the deep chasm between the Hawaiians who had assimilated into island culture and the volunteers from the relocation camps, whose assimilation into mainland culture was thwarted by prejudice. Hawaiians thought the mainlanders were elitist, snobbish, and viewed themselves as the better class of people, while the mainlanders considered the Hawaiians crude, uneducated, and a disgrace to Japanese culture. Fights regularly erupted whenever the two groups came into contact, causing major disciplinary problems for their officers. This changed when the officers sent the Hawaiians to visit a nearby relocation camp in Arkansas. Upon entering the camp with its barbed wire and machine gun towers, and meeting the mainland families who had prepared Japanese meals for their honored guests, the Hawaiians came away profoundly affected by this experience, especially knowing that the mainlanders had volunteered from behind barbed wire. The 100th Infantry Battalion entered into battle initially in North Africa, and then in Sicily and Italy at the beginning of the Allied invasion of southern Europe. They were merged with the 442nd and saw duty in Italy and France in some of the fiercest battles of the war. Nisei volunteers also proved invaluable in the military intelligence service, the MIS, serving as linguists and interpreters throughout the Pacific theater. The service was particularly noteworthy because they were as much in danger of being shot by American troops as by the Japanese. The 442nd motto, "Go for broke," means shoot the works. It's a gambling phrase. And to the Nisei, it meant give it everything you've got. During the course of the war, 31 Nisei volunteers from Amache gave the ultimate in service to their country. Now, here was a people, two-thirds of whom were U.S. citizens, stripped of their constitutional rights, detained as enemy aliens, held behind barbed wire because they looked like the enemy. How did they, in trust and good faith, send forth their sons, husbands, and brothers to fight in the armed forces of the United States? The answer rests in giri, their sense of obligation to the country of their birth. It was also in strong family values of meiyo, of honor and duty, and to the Nisei men themselves, who, like all American sons, were filled with the idealism of youth and a patriotism that belied the fact that they volunteered from behind barbed wire. There was, however, an added factor. These young men held a deep and abiding determination to prove they were truly Americans, not Japanese Americans, but just Americans. In October of 1944, the 442nd was sent to rescue the Texas Lost Battalion. Members of the 1st Battalion, 141st Regiment of the 36th Texas Infantry Division, that was cut off and surrounded by German forces on a steep, isolated ridge in the forest east of Befontaine. Units of the 36th Division had made a number of attempts to rescue their comrades, but without success because the Germans were well entrenched in difficult terrain. The 442nd was called in, and in 4 days of intense fighting, broke through the German lines and captured the original objective of the surrounded battalion, and saved the 211 Texans, while sustaining 1,000 casualties in the process, including 200 killed. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team emerged from the war as the most decorated unit in all of United States military history for its size and for length of service. And this is their record. Following the war in July 15, 1946, the 442nd was honored with a special presidential parade in Washington, D.C., where it received from President Harry S. Truman its 7th Presidential Unit Citation. An aide to the president tried to convince him to cancel the ceremony due to severe storms, but he said that given what these men endured on the battlefields of Europe, he could handle a little rain. President Truman remarked on the occasion, quote, "I can't tell you how much I appreciate the opportunity to tell you what you have done for this country. You fought not only the enemy, but you fought prejudice, and you won. You have made the Constitution stand for what it really means, the welfare of all people, all the time," end quote. Here's a postscript. After a thorough re-examination of the combat records of the 442nd, commissioned by the U.S. Army on orders of Congress, President Bill Clinton on June 21, 2000, bestowed an additional 22 Congressional Medals of Honor to those Nisei who exhibited the ultimate in valor while serving their country. Most of the medals were awarded posthumously and presented to the families of recipients.